or money order for $3.95, plus $2 shipping and handling to Justice for All, care of C-SPAN, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20001.
Coming next on C-SPAN 2, a look at relief efforts in Somalia and proposals for long-term international action. The United States Institute of Peace sponsored this forum to discuss efforts to end the famine and civil war in Somalia and to outline the role of the United Nations after order is restored. The participants in this discussion include Barakat Selassie, one of the founders of the Organization of African Unity. We now bring you the program, which is moderated by Chester Crocker, former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and current Institute Chairman of the Board.
Well, let me say a word of welcome. My name is Chet Crocker. I am chairman of the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's my privilege to be able to help moderate this event this morning. Today's briefing is one in an ongoing series of events that the Peace Institute sponsors related to current conflict issues of interest to the media, the Washington policy community, academia, the general public. Those who are interested in knowing more about the Institute's activities, there is a good bit of literature in the outside room which you are welcome to peruse. The Peace Institute has a very active program in fields related to the Somali crisis, the future of peacekeeping, the issue of humanitarian crisis intervention and responses, the question, of course, more broadly of African conflict resolution and conflict resolution globally. I might point out that our senior coordinator of special Middle East programs, Ambassador Robert Oakley, is, as you know, not only one of this country's leading experts on the country, on Somalia, but is our special U.S. envoy right now in Somalia, working for President Bush and Secretary Eagleberger. Back in October, the Institute convened a discussion conference bringing together a significant number of Somali experts and I should say prominent amongst them, dominant amongst them, Somalis resident in this country of varied professional backgrounds, from the field of academe, from government service and other fields, non-governmental organizations, to discuss the crisis. And as the report which has been distributed to you indicates, this event in mid-October was followed by an in-depth day-long discussion on the 18th of November, which in turn led to the report which you have received. I might just say a word about the Peace Institute in this connection. We are an independent, nonpartisan institution created and funded by Congress to support the expansion of knowledge about peacemaking and conflict resolution through a variety of activities, grant-making fellowships, public education, research and studies, and so forth. The Peace Institute is not part of the U.S. government foreign policy machinery, and it does not take advocacy positions on foreign policy issues. This report is a summary of a conference which the Peace Institute convened. We have an impressive array of expertise on this panel this morning. Regrettably, we learned late last night that Ambassador Mohammed Sanoun, the former special representative of the Secretary General in Somalia, could not be with us this morning, but we have a very substantial pool of talent. Two leading Somali academics who will speak first, and a variety of others, and I will introduce them as they speak. Our purpose today is twofold: to brief you on the report that has been prepared and distributed to you, and then secondly, to offer some comments on broader aspects of the Somali crisis from a variety of perspectives. I will open with a few general remarks, and then I will recognize other speakers. We'll take questions immediately after our first three speakers have made their brief opening observations. Is that speaker not working properly, or am I too close to it? So that there will be an opportunity for question and answer as soon as the first three speakers have spoken, and then we'll go to the other three speakers and take further discussion at that time. We live in amazing times. There are 4 UN-related peacekeeping operations in the news this morning, I just happened to tune in National Public Radio on the way down here. 4 in the news this morning, so that tells you what an amazing situation this is. This is not Somalia's first crisis. Some might say that Somalia is a harbinger of an increasingly disorderly world. The tragedy that has befallen the people of Somalia has many origins and causes. That is not our focus this morning. The real focus is the gap between this crisis and our current procedures and mechanisms. We are learning daily for dealing with situations like this. Sometimes it may seem as if the world's response mechanisms are playing catch-up ball or have failed in some sense. I like to look at it the other way, that we are learning and we are doing and we are innovating at a time that is simply unprecedented in the degree of challenge it poses to existing procedures, mechanisms, and institutions. We are, in other words, at the edge of the envelope. Now, I'm going to ask Professor Ahmad Samatar to open the discussion with some initial observations about the report, which was produced during the mid-November session. Professor Samatar is an associate professor of government at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and has been a lead voice amongst Somali academics on the situation in his country, including the current situation there. So without further words, I will turn the floor and the mic over to you, Dr. Samatar. And I'm going to pass the mic and set an example because we need to actually... Oh, you have one there, okay.
Thank you, Dr. Crocker. It's a pleasure to be here. When Professor Adam and I consulted on how we were going to divide labor in presenting at least some initial parts of the consensus report, we agreed that I would start first and turn Somali tradition upside down today by letting the elders speak later rather than earlier. My remarks today, first of all, would start with giving you some very brief history of how we came to where we are today. And at least for me and a number of colleagues who are sitting here in this room, it started with a conference which was held in Geneva, in Switzerland, last July. That conference brought together about 30 participants. More than 97% of them were Somalis, academics and non-academics, which included community leaders and others who had expertise in well beyond just the academy. And the purpose of that conference really was threefold. One was, first of all, to test a hypothesis which went in the form of whether Somalis, about 30 or so of them, can get together for a couple of days without hacking at each other and to see if they can have a dialogue and a discussion about some very important questions. The second purpose of that conference in Geneva was to see if we can deepen the understanding and the analysis of why this country, one people, one language, one culture, has come apart, and therefore deepen the analysis of the answer to that question, and hopefully go beyond the now rather axiomatic, but at one level superficial approach to Somali crisis. The third purpose was to see if we could ignite by what we produce a new strategy and tactics for trying to help those who want to get involved in, first of all, stopping wars in Somalia, and then the long business of reconstruction. Well, I am here to report that we have been successful, I think, on all accounts, perhaps not as far as we wanted to, but we, I think, made some progress on all three. We produced three things from that conference, tangible things from that conference. One set of recommendations, short-term, medium-term, long-term recommendations. Two, videotaped, I'm afraid in Somali, 2-hour program, discussion program, for the first time really Somali intellectuals and non-intellectuals coming together to debate and discuss what we thought were the critical issues that confront Somali society. And that's now circulating around the world wherever Somali communities live, including in the Horn of Africa. And then a book which we hope will be out at the end of this summer, which will put together and stable together the major papers of the conference. Now, after that conference, two follow-up sessions were held here in Washington, D.C. Some of the participants of the Geneva conference were included in this dialogue, as well as new members who were invited by the Peace Institute. Those two sessions were remarkable, and I would like to therefore take this opportunity to thank the United States Institute of Peace for constant support really from the beginning. Ambassador Oakley and Dr. David Smock, who offered to us their impeccable professionalism and a very fine sense of sensibilities, were quite instrumental in bringing us together and keeping the energy and the momentum going. I therefore want to take this opportunity also to wish Ambassador Oakley success in what is, I think, a great mission in Somalia, and he's making some very good progress. What is the meaning then of this moment quickly? From my perspective, and I think from the perspective of the group that I have been associated with, this is a very important historical occasion and moment for Somalis. It is so, first of all, because it is a very humiliating moment for the people of Somali society. It's demeaning and humiliating. It is so because the Somalis, at least at this particular time, seem to have lost what they had for a very long, long time, and that is a sense of community and a moral commonwealth. That moral commonwealth was based initially on three principles, or three elements made that moral commonwealth, which seem to have been lost. One, a very deep sense of kinship ethos, which is more than clans fighting each other, but a sense of community which had its own center of gravity, an ethos that informed that kinship and sense of communion. Two, Somalis had a customary law, which they call it hair, a set of legal precepts that mediated among individuals and communities when they run into major conflicts, whether it is over water, or whether it's over grazing, or whether it is over other elements of life and the tensions of life. And the third element of that moral commonwealth, which seemed to have been lost, is the spiritual principles of Islam, a sense of fairness, sense of justice, and a piety in front of the Creator. My argument is that I think the reason why the Somali project has derailed, and therefore history in Somalia is rather negative at this particular time, is because the damage has been done to that moral commonwealth. And it is more than just clans fighting over each other because somehow they seem to be programmed that way. It is so humiliating, therefore, this moment, that we have been compelled to allow, at least allow, the international community to intervene so that our own starving people would be fed. That's humiliating. But like any other dialectical situation, this is also, I think, the beginning of a new time in Somalia and in Somali society, at least the beginning of a new hope. It's a beginning of new hope because I think the opportunity is now beginning to appear that Somalis, if they are alert with their friends around the world, can claim from this forge of pressing predicaments two elements which I think are critical for marshalling hope towards a different kind of a future. One is the creation of a new critical intelligence among Somali communities, whether they are here in the States or back home in Somalia. A new kind of a critical intelligence. And then secondly, a reinvigoration of civic temper, which therefore will take us back to perhaps not completely reclaiming, but certainly reconstructing a new moral commonwealth. Those, from my point of view, I think are the immediate promises of this particular moment in Somali society. So I suppose I want to conclude then by my remarks by suggesting that this difficult moment in history, despite its difficulties and agony, is pregnant also with possibilities. And I think William James was right when he wrote more than 100 years ago, and I quote, "It is indeed a remarkable fact that sufferings and hardships do not, as a rule, abate the love of life. They seem on the contrary, usually to give it a keener zest. But it is not only James who have spoken about this. In the great Holy Quran, there is the same wisdom. And the Quran says, "Inna ba'd al-usri yusra." Translated, perhaps not exactly, but closely, after time of agony and pain, there is time of relief. So I will stop here, and I would now shift the gears and give to the elder to speak about the specifics of the consensus report that is in front of you. Thank you.
Let me say a word of introduction. Our next speaker, Dr. Hussein Adam, is an associate professor of political science at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. He is a chronological elder. He's also the guy from whom I first learned a little bit about Somalia, and we're very pleased to have him with us. Before giving him the mic, I think I should just recognize the fact that there are a number of participants in the front of this room who participated with our first two speakers in this exercise in November and before. And I wonder if you all could stand so we could all recognize you as a group, those who participated.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my brother Ahmed for the kind words, and especially for ending with the words of the Quran, which after that is very difficult to say anything. I appreciate when we talked about dividing labor that he took up the task which he's extremely good at, and that is to present a bit of a philosophical and conceptual panorama. My presenting the summary report to you is preceded by brief introductory remarks which are more in the way of the human touch, how human beings crisscrossed each other to come to the meeting. I won't touch all the groups, but a few, as you will see, and a few remarks on the process. And definitely go and follow our report, simply highlight, give an example here, mention if there was any other issue as such. First, I really want to take this opportunity to sincerely thank the American people who have shown by the voting reported on television their strong support for the humanitarian effort, to thank their government, to thank the young military personnel who, though they are not confronted by being shot as they feared and as we told them won't happen, are still depriving themselves of life and Christmas time with their loved ones and facing considerable other hardships, plus the occasional problems we don't know yet. And I want to thank the media, which I think has catalyzed this whole response. I would like to commend my brother Ahmed Samatar for having initiated the initial project that took the meeting to Geneva. He already discussed that. That led us to an expansion with the U.S. Institute for Peace to where we are. And like him, I join him to compliment Dr. David Smoke, who played a key role in our proceedings by recording them as carefully as possible and calling people and getting remarks to make sure they are democratic and they reflect and that we see ourselves in the report. And Ambassador Oakley, both of them have supported and participated actively in our deliberations. I had the opportunity to know Ambassador Oakley when he was appointed to Somalia. I even tried to inform the Somali government when I was working that he's a very senior appointment and that they should take him seriously. I recall he arrived with a lot of energy and tried, if possible, to reorient the dictatorship towards economic affairs. He visited ministries on his own initiative, which was immediately interpreted as interfering with internal affairs and so forth. And after that, the government tried to close him out, which was a great pity. But he learned a lot at that time. He failed in attempting to reform the Siad government. Can we blame him? No, because I failed. So are many Somalis who believed that the best way would have been to reform the government peacefully. Taking arms is a terrible thing, and the consequences you can never tell. So I left in exile, and so many others. I first met Dr. Chester Crocker in 1978 when he invited me to speak at Georgetown. We became friends. I invited him to attend the first Congress of Somali Studies in 1980, held in Mogadishu. In July of 1980, he showed up. He was on an Africanist tour of Africa, and he came to Mogadishu. You have seen that Somali society, which is now becoming very known in America, has its strengths and weaknesses, like all human societies. In my view, and I must say in my view, because in Somali society you can only get along in meetings if you say, in my view, you own your view. Otherwise, all hell breaks loose. People say, no, I don't believe in that. You know, it's a self-determination carried to anarchy, which we are used historically. In my view, our society has a narcissism in it as one of its weaknesses. And even though I've tried to have avoided it, I still have a bit of it. So that when after July, President Reagan was elected in November of that year, and later on in spring, Dr. Crocker was made Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And let me remind you, the first person since the office was formed in the 1960s to be appointed who was an Africanist, a professional Africanist, not a diplomat who comes in and out, was appointed for that job. I believe President Reagan noted in his curriculum vitae that he attended the 1980 Congress of Somali Studies in Mogadishu. that must have been the real decisive win in the short list that he was involved in. In that connection, let me say I've known him to grow. I'm not going to deal with his controversial aspects, which at times in African Studies meeting, whenever I mentioned I was a friend of his, in my sense of loyalty to friendship, I found out I needed bodyguards. I wish I had the ones Oakley has and everybody in Mogadishu has with these attacks. But I have found him to have grown, especially in knowledge of Africa, in particular the Horn of Africa. Much more than is realized, he came to take the Horn of Africa personally and to understand it very, very deeply than his modesty would show. The fifth Congress of Somali Studies, I'm happy to announce, we are now planning to organize in the Boston area in December 1993. And hopefully by then we would have some year on Somali events to see what's going on. It'll be held first part at the College of the Holy Cross, December 1st to the 3rd. And the second part, it will be held as part of the African Studies Association annual meeting, which is taking place at the Westin Hotel in Boston in December 1983. And we will be distributing announcements on that. On our process, I must say, more than the report you're reading, the report itself doesn't tell you that our attempt was to rebuild Somali professionalism, Somali professional groups that were wrecked by Siad's clan poisoning that destroyed even the strata of professionals, friends, and educated people that we had in the country. So this is a modest attempt to do it here, and we are hoping it's done in Canada and in England and, of course, back home. The second part has been that we have been trying to practice democracy among a small group of elite, because the effort to destroy Siad was to bring democracy. The fact that it's aborted and we went into warlords and all doesn't change what the original purpose was. So we thought it begins at home, and therefore we have differed very much, but we have tried to respect one another, and we have tried to work together and get minimum results like the report that you have as an example. And an example even for the younger ones who are here. The third element is we did not want to substitute anyone. We felt we are parallel, we are complementary to similar efforts at home and so on. And in particular, we put emphasis, there is a groups at home that have the primary responsibility. We are complementing them, and we are trying to stay in touch with them. We also very many times paid tribute to professionals at home who, for duty or for no choice, are still there. I was very happy to see in the last 2 weeks, and this is where the media can help us a lot. Channel ABC carried as Man of the Week Dr. Hussein Mursal, whom I knew roughly only, not deeply, working in Somalia, saving lives. He left England, went back, and he was there. And they showed even his family and so on in that program. That is very important, because out of this tragedy, humiliating, is that Somali people, Americans may be left with a sense that the Somalis are nothing but trouble and they really don't help each other. I also saw on CNN the other day a director of the orphan in Baidawa, very articulate, speaking English, the orphanage that just got some food yesterday. I think if the press can portray those examples of committed people who are now going to be more vocal, because the US Army helps to push the guns out of the way, and their role is going to be more prominent. This is one of the best ways to heal Somali society. Finally, our meetings, in spite of heatedness, always had humor and traditional wisdom and proverbs, which are forbidden today because of the time factor. So we will not entertain you with those. Now, let me turn to the report. The report is of 7 points. The first point we agreed on was to provide adequate security for emergency relief. In October meeting, there was no consensus on this point. If you had polled us then whether we should accept foreign troops, there would have been a divided group. By November, there was consensus. The result is obviously what the media showed the American people and us here, of that the situation in our country was really getting worse. It's terrible. And so we agreed that people must be saved from starvation and disease. And to accomplish this, the international community providing relief must have the authority, the resolve, and the military means to deliver relief supplies without obstruction. We had no idea then the US would volunteer to be the leading agency on this. Another point we said, which is very important in this, is that it should be made clear to local factions that the international community has no intention of recolonizing Somalia or of transforming Somalia into UN trusteeship. These views are in some corridors of the UN, pursued by some UN bureaucrats, certain countries that some Somali groups feel hostile to, and also certain Somalis who, for some reason or another, wants to pursue some revenge or side. The second point was to adopt approaches to different regions of the country. We tried to agree, and we cautioned that the north, which is now Somaliland Republic, which is relatively better off, didn't have any drought, should be assisted, otherwise it could easily degenerate and become like the situation in Baidawa. The second area of northeast, which is administered around Bosaso, similarly. And even in the south, to be diverse in application of those areas, one could move from relief to reconstruction. While in the areas in the Baidawa you have seen, it is really famine and food first, and then relief, which means health and so on, for some time before even considering reconstruction. We talked highly of the role of NGOs, and we noticed the growth of Somali NGOs even during the dictatorships. On this issue, it was proposed, but not yet agreed fully, at least not pursued. Maybe once we should have a meeting with non-governmental organizations, and since there are many representatives here, maybe they could also take this initiative with the US Peace Institute to have a meeting with our group and them. The third was to help organize police forces on a regional basis. This was a third consensus point. We felt that the best way to organize any administration in Somalia now is to work at the local levels. I don't think it's going to be difficult to administer Mogadishu if you say you're building a little administration for Mogadishu and for its 15 or 14 quarters and so on, and work fast that way. But to pose national or central government, you get into all the other problems that may need time. The fourth, to enforce the international arms embargo. And here we mentioned other countries who are interfering, certain Islamic countries, but in particular we mentioned Kenya, which was arming and helping groups cross the border to continue the civil war in Somalia. The fifth, to take account of the role of Islam in the process of reconciliation. Here we notice that in spite of Siad's attacks on Islam, and in spite of Islamic fundamentalism, the Somali Islamic movement has tended to be Islamic revivalism. rather than fundamentalism. This is very important. Revivalism implies piety to the individual, especially in period of chaos, as Ahmed has just quoted the Quran. And it's more people are praying, more people are spontaneously going to the mosque, and so on. But not many people are willing to accept politicized Islam. There is a little bit of it appeared in the northeast region, but even there, it has been vanquished, the radical element. The sixth point is to promote reconciliation. And here we encourage that the political parties that fought Siad, whatever the names, to be taken seriously a bit that way, but to encourage them to be more democratic. Why are they not having congresses? Why are they not having elected leaderships and so on? So it's pushing them back to the original democratic agenda, but it also takes into account the realities that they claim to control parts of the country. But many of them are divided inside, and to help them first heal inside. And a beginning task you can see Ambassador Oakley has undertaken has been to heal the rift within the United Somali Congress that was symbolized by the meetings recently in Mogadishu. We agreed, though, the leadership issue goes beyond the nominality of these parties, that should include all the traditional clan leaders, all the religious leaders, all the personalities respected in society which are known, business people, women leaders, some student leaders, and so forth. And finally, we took up the question of which you may say is a longer range one, of whether Somalia should be, we agree that there's a debate out, should be 2 states, because Somaliland Republic has declared independence. And arguments for and against have been raised in our meetings. We also took up the question of whether it should go back to a unitary state, with also some idea, but it won't be exactly the way it was, with some modifications. And also the third, whether it should be a confederation that takes into account 2 states, but who are one confederate republic, united with certain things at the top. On this issue, we agreed completely to postpone this issue, not to be involved on it right now, because it is definitely an issue that may come maybe 6 months or a year or 2 years from now, and that we should focus our attention, and the people who are trying to help Somalia focus their attention to the question of famine and the question of starvation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both of our first 2 speakers for trying to summarize under our time constraints what was a protracted and an exhausting process over the course of many days and hours, and I realize what a job that is to try and condense it. We've asked next Dr. Barakat Selassie to say a few words from a perspective of a native of the Horn of Africa, a native of Eritrea, who has spent many years thinking about the problems of security in the Horn of Africa, a former Attorney General of Ethiopia, a guy who was around when they wrote the OAU Charter. Currently, Barakat is a distinguished fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and serves as a professor of African Studies at Howard University. Barakat?
Thank you, Chet. I would like to commend the Peace Institute for taking the initiative to hold a symposium to which several Somali scholars and former government officials came and gave the benefit of their wisdom and experience. And also Ahmed Samatta, who originally took the initiative to organize the conference to which I was supposed to be a participant, but family matters detained me from attending it. I'm also gratified to see at least one Somali dispute settled, and that is the question of who is the elder, Ahmed Samatta or Hussein Muhammad Adam. There has been some acrimonious exchanges between these 2 Somali friends as to who is the elder. Each one of course, vying to be the elder, because in African society, being an elder is a privilege, unlike in countries nearer home. You see, an elder, the notion of elder is a sociological function. It has certain duties attached to it, and so people aspire to become elders when they are young. I am not a Somali, but I am not a stranger to Somali affairs. I even have a Somali nickname. The Somalis call me Inalayal, which means son-in-law. Someone who probably saw me entering the palace of Mohammed Siad Barre a few times thought maybe I was married to one of his daughters. I was not. It is a matter of great grief for me and for many Africans to see a nation, a proud nation, humiliated in the way that Somalia has been. But in the circumstances that we've seen over the last few weeks, our living rooms showing us the haunting images of young children dying with their helpless mothers standing helpless as internationally provided relief food was literally taken out of the mouths of children. In these circumstances, there was no alternative but for some of us to not only accept and commend, but seek the intervention of the international community. I therefore, again, record my appreciation and commendation of President Bush's decision to intervene decisively. There have been many comments about his motive, which I think is irrelevant. I personally am persuaded that the motives were humanitarian. It shows the better side of the better nature of America, the better tradition. I also agree with my friend Chet Crocker that this may set a precedent in the post-Cold War era about humanitarian intervention. And I think this is a salutary development myself. There have been a few voices opposed to this, particularly a very brilliant young Somali woman who lives in London, for reasons which are still not clear to me. My concern about the present form of intervention is that it might be misunderstood as the be-all and all. The military phase is only a facilitating phase, in my view, securing the safe passage and distribution of relief, food and other forms of relief. And I would hope, enabling Somalis to put their acts together, to regain their sense of nationhood and reconstruct their nation. I can see that the present mission cannot do that. The military phase of the mission per se cannot do that. But I see the great need for a clear definition of the mission, of the UN mission, in what follows after the first phase of this intervention. I have not seen any clear declaration of such a mission myself so far. I am sure it must be in the works. And I'm sure that the US and the UN must be working together on this. Otherwise, the entire operation would become not only futile, but even dangerous, because it has raised expectations. Some people, for political reasons, question the wisdom of the United States being involved in this phase of the mission. But I think, although I do not subscribe to the notion that Somalia should be recolonized, or that a UN trusteeship should be imposed on Somalia, there has to be some United Nations presence for a long time to come to enable the rehabilitation of infrastructure, social, physical infrastructure, the roads and bridges that have been destroyed, but also social infrastructure in the form of the very valuable, very precious legacy of the Somali elders, who've always done a wonderful job in mediating between conflicting groups. There is there an aspect of Somali society which is not appreciated very much. The tendency of the media in the past has been to present a caricature picture of a situation, of a very complex reality. I think the coverage of this particular crisis, however, has been commendable. There's been many attempts to present a more than one-dimensional picture of the crisis there. That must continue. Because I come from the region, because I have been involved in Somali research of different aspects of Somali society, above all, because as a citizen I feel the need to be clear about certain things, I feel that the intervention should have consulted with local regional forces, I am referring to the government of the region. I am aware of the fact that historically there's been some enmity between Somalia and Ethiopia. I'm aware of the fact that Djibouti is a mini state which cannot do anything, really, to help out in this situation. I am aware of the fact that Eritrea, which is a fledgling nation, is not even in the consciousness of people. Nevertheless, it has been my pleasure to see Eritreans, even though they don't have the resources, have been at the forefront, quietly mediating between the feuding Somali parties, without success. I would be very much interested. I had welcomed the presence of Mohammed Sahnoun, because there's a story that is yet to be told. I don't know what happened exactly. He made valiant mediation efforts, going back and forth in the area, in the region, not only within Somalia itself, but in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and elsewhere. For some reason, his initiatives were not appreciated by the headquarters in New York, and he was dismissed. I want to know, I am very curious as to exactly what happened, because that story may hold the key to the possibility of successful mediation effort in the future, because we have a lot to come. Anybody who is going to represent the UN Secretary General to do the mediation, to create or to help create the enabling environment to help the Somalis to regain their pride, their sense of nationhood, and above all, to reconcile among themselves. Anybody who has this task has his work cut out for him. And that person or group of persons will need the support of the Somalis themselves, the elders, the political leaders, the professionals, the intellectuals. They will need the help of people from the region, the Ethiopian government, which seems to be very well disposed towards Somalia. I think the Ogaden question has become a non-issue. So I personally would recommend the consultation to take place with Ethiopia, with Eritrea, with Kenya also. I'm not convinced that President Arap Moi is so foolish as to arm or rearm the Morgan forces against the prevailing wind of international criticism. The OAU's failure and the failure of other local organizations, the Islamic Conference, shows a failure of Africa. Political failure, moral exhaustion, which I have been witnessing for many years. Perhaps one lesson that might be learned from the Somali tragedy is the need for Africa to revive its sense of morality. Each nation has its own crisis to take care of, so each nation feels that it's not its neighbor's keeper. I think I'll stop there, Chet, and perhaps entertain questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Barakat. As promised, now we're going to open the floor for a few moments for questions and discussion focused on these initial observations, and there'll be a time later probably to come back to some of these themes as well, but knowing that a number of you here are in fact working journalists, we thought we should not postpone any longer the chance to go to questions and discussion. When you do raise your hand and speak, could you please identify yourself briefly for our panelists and address your question to a specific person? Yes, sir.
I had two questions to the last speaker.
Could you identify yourself,
Yeah,
please?
sorry. Milton Meitenberg, Center for International Security Studies, University of Maryland. First, I want to remove some of the ambiguities. There's several countries permitting arms to cross borders. You mentioned Kenya, which we've heard about, and other Islamic countries. Could you say which countries and which countries to which factions or leaders within the country? The other has to do with the disarming of the unorganized youth who are terrorizing. This seems to be something also that should now be dissipated. General Aidid also called for the setting up of police forces and clearly meant his own people to become the police forces, and that they would do this disarming seems terribly fatuous. How many of those technicals are in fact from General Aidid's forces? Because when he called them back to these cantonments, they virtually all disappeared. Could you give some estimate of how many of those people come in fact from General Aidid or other factions?
Well, there are parts of your question that no one can answer except God right now. Because we don't have the information. We just don't. Even if I came from Mogadishu, even Aidid doesn't have a full information of how many technicals he controls. Because this was a spontaneous, surprising, calling clanmen from the bush and allied clans by marriage or by paternal, and they all join into the taking over of Mogadishu, joined by others and others, among whom there's a core of thugs and gangsters who, whenever in public, would say they are with Ali Mahdi or they will say they were with Aidid. You see, so that's really the chaos. I think as the peace withdraws, it'll be clear. Now, the idea of saying police, and Aidid says, this is the group I am selecting to be the police, local police, and Ali Mahdi does the same, will clarify that, because then they will identify the groups they feel confident. These groups will be trained, given uniform, hopefully trained, given salaries and independence, will slowly move them away from personal forces into established local police forces. I say not military force. That may come. But that's the hope. But there's no way out of that now, because the two groups are still the ones who have force in that area of Somalia. As for the arms, it has been said that the Sudanese government, Iran, are trying to push Islamic fundamentalism and therefore pushing some aid to a number of these opposition groups, both in the north, northeast, and in these we have no proof except what the newspapers say. I don't see anyone who has fully checked it. The question I said earlier is, if that's what they are planning, it's not working because there is no strong fundamentalist groups. There are elements of individuals who are fundamentalists, but not movement within all the Somali. Clanism is still stronger than Islamic politicized in Somali society, and it checks it. Anytime Islam tries to take over, the clan factor neutralizes it. That's just, one can take it positive or negative. The Kenyan factor had to do with the fact that there are clans that cross the border on either side, and there is the fact that the head of the Kenyan army is a Somali Kenyan, but still acts often more of a Somali than a Kenyan, and so on. And that has, whether Moi follows it or not, this has had implications, terrible implications, in especially the former Siad forces that are relying on his support.
The only thing I would add, maybe two things. I think one, the claims that are going to be made and are being made by different factional leaders are highly exaggerated because each one of them wants to put himself in a strategic position so that when the final game is played, they will come out the winners. So they will make very exaggerated claims in terms of how many people are under their control and what kind of orders they will give. But I would agree with Hussein on that, that there is, I think, a significant amount of people who have guns, so-called technicals, who really have not any serious allegiance to any group. They are driven by the buffeting of hunger and destitution and survival in a place that life has fallen apart, and therefore they're going to do whatever they can to win their bread for the day, even if that means taking it out of the mouth of the hungry. I think the construction of a police force, therefore, which is necessary to establish some kind of a security, there's not going to be any political establishment without security, the definition of the state itself, that has to be part of the project of reconstruction and the professionalizing, therefore, of a new security forces. One issue on fundamentalism and Islamic influence in here, I have a little different take on that than Hussein. I think the moral degeneration of the Somali society is so deep that to write off Islamic influence, very serious fundamentalist influence, fundamental in the sense of having a kind of a dense ideological approach to this, is real. And I think as people begin to find the kinship of old doesn't hold water anymore outside of we against them, people are looking for other things to grab. I was giving a talk at the University of Toronto about 2 weeks ago, and there's a full auditorium of Somalis. And they had no interest in talking about clanism. They wanted to talk about the bringing of Islamic fundamentalism into Somalia. And that was the only way which they thought is going to take them out of this mess. So I think it's really important not to overlook both the external imposition of particular reading of Islam into Somali politics as regional powers want to shift things and make their own, I suppose, sub-imperial kind of order in the place. But also, I think the internal growth of a new kind of an ideology which is going to give the Somalis, from their perspective, a different approach to solve these problems.
I note that part of the question that was asked can only be answered by the Lord, and so we will leave it there. Yes, in the back of the room, you had your hand up. Please identify yourself.
I'm Gil Kulik from the American Foreign Service Association. My old friend Hussein made, I think, a very cogent point, which is that we need to be thinking, even now, while the relief operations are going on, about what the long-term role of the UN is going to be in national reconstruction and reconciliation. I note that the Secretary General is convening, or at least the patron of the meeting that will take place in Addis Ababa on January 4th to lay the foundations for that process of national reconciliation. And I was wondering what our two Somali panelists expect to come out of that meeting, and if either of you have any sort of long-term sense of how long it will take this process to produce some kind of interim administration which can begin to take over the country, and what the role of the UN will be in fostering that process.
Yes, I'll be brief, Gil, because we don't have the answers also, and there's no need to pretend. But I can say one thing which I thought we discussed as a group here was the advice on a step-by-step approach, which I'm glad Bob Oakley has followed. That is, I think it doesn't really work well to call just, declare from New York, Somali leaders must meet me in Addis Ababa on January 4th. Some will not show up. We know that now. But if they go like this, get these Ali Mahdi and ID together, and then have a regional meeting that constitutes USC, which we know implies a particular major Somali clan family, and get harmoniously going, and its towns, whether it's Beledweyne or Mogadishu, administered, and you push those, then you have 5 major regions in Somalia, which are de facto administering themselves with confidence, and they have an ability, they have movement. At that point, they themselves will take the initiative of wanting to meet. But if you call them in Addis, you're going to face some who are still fighting, came from fighting, who have not resolved their relationship, like I did and Ali Mahdi. You're going to the North, which says it's an independent state, which more likely will probably not attend, and so on. You see, different levels. Neither do they ever take some criteria, or who are they inviting, clan family level or clans, or individuals floating, free floating. It seems to me it's done haphazard, and the work is to do like Bob Oakley, just go on the ground. I hope now after he finishes here, he goes to the next region, probably the Northeast, for example, and talk to them, and have a meeting in the Northeast, you say, and go to the Somaliland. That's the way I would see it.
Can I just add one point? I think the involvement of the international community, the United Nations, U.S. government, and others in this process is useful, at least in the following way. Part of the crisis of the Somali society, from my perspective, and why you have these different voices, cacophony of voices claiming leadership, is really a crisis of leadership itself. And one of the ways I think in which international conferences of that kind can do minimally is to put the floodlights, international floodlights, on all of these claimants to the throne, and find out, therefore, what they are made of in terms of their capacity to articulate their cause and to legitimize themselves as potential leaders. I thought at that level, I think it is useful to convene those kinds of conferences, to test these people outside of the parochial neighborhood that they claim. But I think Hussein is right that while that is going on, I think the process of grassroots, region by region kind of a negotiation and reconciliation also has to gather momentum. And maybe the two, therefore, can be clipped together in a way that will produce something useful.
Yes, right here.
Hey, Maddox, Voice of America. And this is a question for Dr. Selassie and also Ambassador Sanoun, if he is here.
Not here.
Oh, okay. Can you address the perceived failure of the United Nations about this during 1991 concerning the Somali crisis. And in light of that, how realistic do you think it is that the United Nations will be able to take over once the Marines leave and peacekeep effectively?
This is a question, actually, which I had hoped Ambassador Sahnoun would address, and it is very unfortunate that he is not here. I cannot give you a first-hand information. My guess will be as good as yours. The failure of the United Nations is a function of its nature, its membership, the way it operates. But I thought in this particular instance there was a good challenge because they had complete support of their members. The Secretary General had complete support of the United States, for instance, and his Western allies. There was no objection from the Russians or anybody else. And they had appointed a man, a seasoned diplomat, well liked by his colleagues in Africa, and also by the Somalis, an Algerian, a Muslim, who was the #2 man in the OAU for many years. That's when I first met him. An honorable man, a good negotiator, who has been appreciated, whose very low-key operation was appreciated by all and sundry as long as it lasted. What he saw on the ground was the necessity of consulting with local forces, governments as well as non-governments. And when this is my information, which is unofficial, when he sought the green light from headquarters to go on, for instance, along this route, he was either neglected, ignored, or the red light was put on. Then he decided to blow the whistle, so to speak, and he was dismissed. Now, it needn't have happened. It may be, I think, a good lesson for the future operation. The United Nations is all we've got. It's all we've got in the international community. The United States is bearing the brunt of the burden in this operation, as it did in operation in the Gulf region. But it had to have the mantle of legitimacy. It had to ask the United Nations to come in. And the United Nations will replace the forces, the United States forces, by calling upon member nations in the second phase. The second and third phase, obviously, is a political one. It will involve, it should involve Somalis sitting together and composing the differences. The end's role will be two, I think, in my opinion. To enable them to speak, to facilitate their meetings, and secondly also to provide enormous resources, which is needed, to reconstruct Somalia. The schools and the hospitals have been destroyed. The facilities that need to be reconstructed, it will be the task of the United Nations.
I might just add that Ambassador Sahnoun's initial statement on what happened and what must now happen is in the public domain. He'll be doing more speaking and writing, no doubt, and he is going to be associated with the Peace Institute upon his return to Washington. But he did write an extensive piece in the LA Times of November 30th for those who might want to make reference to it. Are there additional questions, particularly from our friends in the media who are seeking to... Yes, sir. I don't think you're in the media, but go ahead and take the mic.
My name is Mukhtar, Mohammed Mukhtar, and first of all, I would like to thank or to record my sincere thanks to the United States and this stand they have taken to help Somalia. According to what one reporter said, America seemed to be another clan to Somalia. In fact, they are a bigger clan in Somalia right now, and they are the nicer and the kinder clan in Somalia.
With the best technicals.
I don't have questions, but I want to make some comments and some observations. A few questions were raised before, and the answers, as you all have seen, nobody could have answered. Everybody said, I cannot answer this question. This reminds me that in Somalia, I know that the Somali conditions are very difficult, and the situations that we are having right now is so frightening. I think that Somalia or Somalis, they were always trying to make some decisions on certain things that they don't know the causes of those turmoils. So if you decide on something that you don't know what caused, it will always be difficult for you to answer certain questions. It's true, I don't blame my colleagues. They cannot answer these questions. I cannot answer these questions because we ourselves don't know our realities, the Somali reality. And it's very unfortunate. What I'm trying to say is that we Somalis do not confuse our friends, the international community. We have to really first try to understand and seriously, systematically analyze, re-examine our Somali conditions. Then, of course, after that, we can offer some solutions. And it's very easy. Once we realize what we are, then we can understand, we can find the answer. For the last year and a half, we were confused about why these miseries are happening in Somalia. And if we were consulted, we were not able to offer any possible, really, suggestions. And in fact, I'm very happy that the United States took this decision without consulting Somalis, because if they consult on us, we will confuse and we will create more problems to them. Therefore, it's a very golden opportunity that a month ago, we were so concerned about what we are going to do about the humanitarian crisis. But today, that is settled. The other problem that we are facing, perhaps, is going to be the political governing system in Somalia. If we are again consulted about how we like our future governing system, we again will confuse the international community. I'm not saying that we cannot do anything, but I'm just underlining that if Somalis are consulted about their problems, they're not going to offer any possible solutions. Why this triangle of death? People were dying. Why we are so humiliated when foods were given to us and we were not giving to our people? It's so humiliating to every Somali and could be a smear to all Somalis. But I understood later when I found the axis of this triangle were run by people who don't belong to the triangle. So the answer is very easy and simple, because in African conditions, we have clans who really colonize or neo-colonize other clans. So for a Somali, General Aidid, General Morgan, Colonel Jess, if we look at their biography, even they are not born in the place that they are. So the answer is very simple, because these clans are trying to dominate these clans. And what's the difference between a European or African to colonize a clan? So it's very easy. If we try to understand what are our realities, then we can easily find answers for certain questions. I'm very happy that the United States also are asking us to help them with this operation, that they ask Somali interpreters to go to Somalia. The mistakes that we are still doing is that if you send a Somali who cannot understand the language of the triangle of death, how he can interpret? Because we already built the myth that Somalia is so homogeneous, so unique, that we speak the same language. So probably I try that. What I'm trying is, let us try not to confuse also the world. What I would suggest is that we say we have differences and diversities, and I think it's a very beauty to have a nation with all these diversity. What's wrong with that? Why we have to really hide our realities? The more we hide our realities, the more we cannot find any answer for all these questions that are going to be raised in this forum. So my last point is that, yes, the political governance system is very necessary, that we have to do something about it. Because already the international community is providing for us all the possibilities and, that we might not have before. But again, if we are right now concentrating on the clan issues, and if we want to really think of the future clan government, I think we have to be really more ahead than that, because clans already approved that they are not going to work. For the last 2 years, we had 2 interim governments in Somalia, 2 clan interim governments. The northern clan interim government didn't work. The southern interim government didn't work because of the clan. Aidid and Mahdi, they belong to the same clan. Tur belongs to the same Misaki clans, but it's not working. So if you still want to build that notion and say, okay, let's build another clan government. If the Hawiyas cannot build their own government and the Isaks cannot do, then how you expect to have a bigger clan nation, Somali nation? So I would like to underline that when we're thinking about clan, this clan is not going to work for several reasons. One,
we have to move along.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think Hussein wants to say just a word, and then we're going to move on to the other speakers on our panel.
The speaker, Mahmoud Mukhtar, is close friend of mine. We taught together at the university. He comes from Baidawa. He's one of the very few from the Rahanwein clan family. In fact, the only one or 2 or 3 in the US. And even though he was speaking like a Somali indirectly and in the clouds, I have to just be straight with you. But as I was reading a report Dr. Crocker gave me here, the Los Angeles Times went straight to the point and said that the problem in Baidawa was a bit like Bosnia. That is, the Rahanwein clan, who did not fight or support the president, found themselves disarmed. So we had 2 policies to deal with, and he was part of our first meeting. He remembers well. We had raised that issue strongly. That either you give them arms, in which case this mess would not have occurred, because they would have beaten the Kenyan invasion side and the Mogadishu attempt, or you send the troops. And it's decided finally to send the troops.
Thank you very much. I think what we're learning here is that all of our confusion needs to be raised to a much higher level, and I must say I admire enormously our Somali colleagues in this meeting for sharing that so openly with us. I am now going to ask General Indar Ricky to say a few words. General Ricky is the special advisor on UN affairs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has been about as experienced as one can be in the area of multilateral peacekeeping operations. He's worked on them for over 34 years, and he knows probably more than any of us here that we are indeed pushing the edge of the envelope when we do the kind of things we're seeing in the world today. Indar, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have very carefully noted the advice and the wisdom of our Somali elders. And so, very much bearing that in mind, although my role at the U.S. Institute of Peace is to advise them on UN affairs, I will refrain from making any comments about the role of Ambassador Sanoom. Furthermore, since he's coming here to join us, I hope in the very near future, I'm sure we will have opportunities face-to-face to discuss some of the very important issues which relate with the future of the institutional arrangements of the United Nations, which arose over the whole controversy of the role of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General. Therefore, my comments will focus what I believe are the 2 issues of the UN-sponsored humanitarian relief effort in Somalia. The first will deal with the second phase. That is to say, the UN peacekeeping operation that will follow the current United States humanitarian military relief effort, which of course will take some time before it is to be completed. My second comment will deal with the question of disarming armed Somalis and curbing the influx of weapons into Somalia. The central issue, I believe, in the current debate is between the UN Secretary General Boutros-Ghali and the Bush administration is on the requisite conditions for the start of phase 2 of the operation, on completion of the operational part of the Security Council resolution of 3rd of December. And I will refer to that. In this resolution, the Council, in welcoming the United States offer of troops to create a secure environment for humanitarian relief, also the offer by other member states in participating in this particular operation authorized the Secretary General and member states. Please note, Secretary General and member states. There are two separate institutional arrangements created for the implementing of this resolution, which doesn't happen very often in the UN. And the member states cooperating to implement the offer referred to by me already, to use all necessary means to establish as soon as possible a secure environment for humanitarian relief operation in Somalia. Considering that the peacekeeping operation previously authorized by the Council, by its Resolution 775, was not properly, it was not successful. It required consent of the parties, which they were able to obtain with great difficulties. And you know, Ambassador Sahnoun spent much of the year in trying to obtain that consent, which he barely obtained. And then once the troops were allowed, which was a very fine battalion of from Pakistan, they were not permitted to leave their premises, neither the port nor the airport. They could only have done so by acting aggressively, which is contrary to the rules of engagement of traditional peacekeeping. Traditional peacekeeping must be non-enforcement, that is, through an agreement, through the consent of the parties. And the parties, having given their consent with great reluctance, then refused to permit them to operate outside their particular camps. So I believe the UN's request for disarming the Somalis, made to President Bush and this administration, is based on the very reasons which it has experienced and which I believe deserve our consideration. The first point I'd like to make there is, since the United States forces intend to disarm only such armed groups or so-called technicals who obstruct their operation, most of the fighters we know have ceased to be hostile and are keeping their weapons. When the United States troops withdraw, a likely UN peacekeeping force will take over from them. With its non-enforcement role, which I've already mentioned, its rules, the rules of engagement, which I've already stated, they will not be able to cope with any armed factions who may return to the scene as soon as the United States troops have departed. The second point I'd like to make is, with the armies of the clan leaders intact, it is feared that the United Nations will be putting a seal on the future leadership of the country. No member state is willing to support the existing leadership because it is military in nature, and it is the determination of the United Nations in the spirit of today that we should move as rapidly as possible to a democratic process. So therefore, the United Nations is cautious in this respect and therefore is asking for the disarmament of the various factional forces. The point I would like to make here is that this is a matter to be worked out between the Secretary General and member states. The member states cannot arrive at a unilateral decision outside the consultation with the UN Secretary General, and the Secretary General cannot impose anything on any of the member states. It has to be with the consent, and therefore it means the subject to be negotiated. And what with only 4 weeks left of this administration, I think it's rather late in the day. And all they can possibly achieve is to allow the United States to continue their operation in the excellent manner, superb manner in which they're doing, and thereby they will, of course, create a certain measure of security. Otherwise, the relief operations will not be possible. They will, in some extent, be able to impose a certain degree of law and order. And that will create conditions sufficiently for the second phase to continue, as well as for the new administration, when it takes its place, and then allow them a few weeks or possibly a few months before they're able to reach any particular decision. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would venture some personal views on how we might handle this particular situation. The first one is that the United Nations, backed by the United States, should vigorously pursue its efforts to bring Somali warlords and elders together to agree, or Somali leadership, as has been explained to us by our Somali colleagues, into some kind of an interim authority. I think we need an interim authority, and I believe that Bob Oakley and Ismet Katani, the UN representative's efforts are moving in that direction to be able to arrive at some interim administration, and I believe that is what they will be striving for at the forthcoming meeting. I think this is very important. They should decide on the return of all heavy weapons, which should be kept in United Nations storage. These weapons should be turned over to the Somali army when it is formed by a duly acceptable and recognized government by the Somalis. Third, the interim Somali administration should decide on the rules for owning personal light arms by Somalis as soon as this interim administration is established. Lastly, in the question of the influx of weapons from outside, surely the United States forces, as they deploy more into the interior, will immediately be performing this particular function to a considerable degree. And when that phase is completed, we begin phase 2, which is when they begin to hand over to the UN troops. The UN troops have considerable experience in monitoring arms control embargoes and will be able to secure the airports and all entry points. Of course, if they are violated, then of course the United Nations troops will not be allowed to use force, but instead will report to the Secretary General, who will then bring it to the attention of the Security Council for necessary action. And I know, as you all know, that these can be very complex and very long-winded and take a great deal of time, like, for instance, applying the sanctions as far as Bosnia is concerned on the Serbs, or the flow of arms or gas and oil and other projects for the Serbs. These do present enormous difficulties. So therefore, as much as it is possible for the United States forces to do without undue risk of getting involved in an open combat, I believe they'll be able to do a lot. And from what I hear, the language being used by the military commanders in the field of the United States leaders, they're going to do quite a bit. I am quite optimistic, and I'm quite hopeful that in the superb manner in which these troops have performed their very difficult, very sensitive humanitarian role, I am sure that when they leave at the conclusion of phase 1, they would have left the place quite tidy for the UN to take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Rickey. I am now going to recognize Ms. Adowa Dunmutan, professional staff member with the African Affairs Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Adowa has been to Somalia fairly recently. She has worked a lot on this issue with her principals, I should say, in the Senate, and I know we look forward to a congressional perspective on the unfolding story of U.S. and international involvement in Somalia. Adowa.
Thank you. I'd like to first commend the U.S. Institute for Peace and the Somalis, who have come together to present, I think, to the American public, and to certainly, no, I'm sorry, my low voice, wrong tone. That's why I never made it as a teacher. I'd again like to commend the U.S. Institute for Peace and the Somalis who've come together. I think it is important, especially as we find ourselves, the American public, involved in a country where we know very little, that this certainly helps to educate American public and therefore the American Congress. I'd like to start by saying first, it was difficult as I kind of tried to figure out what is the congressional perspective on Somalia. I had to admit that there is no monolithic view on Somalia in the Congress. And so I'd like to adopt Professor Adams' approach, and that is that this is my view of what U.S. Congress how U.S. Congress is looking at the current situation. And to understand that, I think that it is important for us to really recognize the role that Congress has played on this issue over the past 5 years. One for you, right?
I think so.
Is this better? No, it's the same. Oh, it is. Good. Okay. The Congress has looked at the issues of Somalia over the past 5 years in a variety of ways through a number of congressional hearings and discussions with regard to assistance to Somalia during Siad Barre's days, and was at odds on many occasions with the administration. In the last 18 months, the issue of Somalia has, for the Subcommittee on Africa in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has really been our major issue. It has dominated our agenda. We have had more hearings on Somalia, more meetings, more resolutions, more bills, and the more floor statements and press conferences on Somalia, trying to at least raise the issue of Somalia to higher levels, to encourage the international community through our own government to be more responsive to what we saw was a real failed policy. And while you can say the UN has failed, I think we must recognize that the UN is simply made up of its members. And so it does mean that what we see today in Somalia is the international community's failure. And I think that we have a chance which has been, which is a result of the Bush administration's forceful policy of putting troops on the ground in a big way that will give us the options to change our failures in Somalia. What is Congress thinking? Well, today we have our first hearing. I think many in Congress, and most especially the member who I work with, Senator Paul Simon, and I'm sure I could speak also for Senator Nancy Kassenbaum, both who are members of the Subcommittee on Africa, that we have much praise for the administration in taking this decisive step. We do feel that that the support has to come from Congress to ensure that the administration and the military is able to move in the way that it has to move. I think that because it is a military action, it's clear that Congress will not be able to sit back and decide, should we be doing this, should we be doing that, is disarmament a problem, how long are we going to be engaged in this, what are going to be the changing rules of engagement. It is going to be difficult, and I think that Congress is going to be very uncomfortable in having to be placed in a position of really responding to the situation and not really necessarily directing it. Where do we go from here? I think that on the question of the next steps, that we have already, through Congress, passed a bill called the Horn of Africa Recovery Act, which does provide an authorization for assistance to Somali NGOs. It was a bill that was designed to provide assistance when there was conflict, to provide assistance when there were not governments that you could provide assistance to. How that will move forward, I think, will be certainly guided by the reconciliation efforts. The efforts that have been outlined here, I think, are critical, the step-by-step, those efforts that are most closely associated with the work of Ambassador Sanoun, I think are very important in how we move forward and how we resolve or help Somalis resolve the situation in their country. I think that with in the response to the UN's continued role, the fact that the U.S. has modified its role, we will see, I think, a new UN. We must see a new UN if we are to deal with this issue and issues of other major concern in the region and on the continent and in the world. The fact that there are similar situations that are brewing in other countries that are going to require the UN's taking an active role will have to be, I think that we will need to use the lessons that we learned from Somalia to guide us in those next steps. That is in Sudan, in Mozambique, Liberia, and the list unfortunately goes on too far. Maybe I'll just stop right there.
Thanks very much, Adwa. Well, you've all been very patient in listening to a lot of presentations. I'm not going to make any extensive commentary, just a couple of observations, and then we'll throw it open again for further discussion with all of us, if that's agreeable. When the administration's announcement of its decision to offer forces first hit the media, I, like many in this room, was asked to occasionally go on television or on the radio and answer a question or two. And the questions all focused on some very important and very hard specific issues, like what's your exit strategy? And will there be a doctrine of disarming warlords and their technicals? And exactly at what moment will you hand over again to the United Nations? And exactly in which month are they coming home? And I was so impressed at the brilliance of the questions. It struck me that the people asking them could have talked any administration out of anything. But that, of course, is precisely the role of the media, and we all understand that, and so we all relax and say, okay, those are good questions. To some of them, to some of those questions, there might be some good answers today, but I think we owe it to ourselves to say that there are not going to be good answers to all those questions today, and that to some degree it's an act of faith to do what has been done. And when I say faith, I mean that in many ways. Faith about the political situation of the world and where it's moving, faith on the part of individual leaders who may or may not know each other, but also faith in the sense that this is above all an act of human solidarity that we're talking about, which has all kinds of broader implications that we can reflect upon. But there simply are not hard answers to all those skeptical questions. I'm certain that within the administration and within other governments who quickly stepped forward to join the U.S., there was an effort to go through an exercise of worst-casing it, to see how this might work, to make certain it wouldn't blow up in our faces, to try and avoid a situation, and I think people have been sensitive up to now, in which American leadership could produce a backlash. I don't think any of us want to see that, a backlash at home or abroad. But the real issue is one of, if you're going to act, one has to be aware of the fact that it's partly an act of faith. You have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to accept the possibility that you'll be living in an ambiguous world in which some of the questions can only be answered tomorrow when you get there. Some of the questions can only be answered when you reach out, as Ambassador Oakley has begun to do, starting out every morning, to the people in which our forces will be operating, the people locally where the forces will be operating, and make those initial contacts and build those bridges and start a process of communication locally and regionally. If you don't talk, obviously you've got even more unknowns and you don't have a clue what the answer is, and you'll scare yourself out of the job. If you do talk, if you do open up, if you listen as well as talk, perhaps there's a chance to make the thing go right, even though you admit to yourself that a lot of it, by definition, is improvisation. So I think that's the spirit in which this is being done up to now. I'm full of admiration for the people who made this decision. I would point out, and I think it's worth stressing, that it is not simply a question of the UN Secretary General and his military advisory staff and the Security Council, and then the U.S. administration. There were many other people around the world who were involved in this exercise. There are African contributing nations to the special force, and that is vital, and that is a key element of this operation, I'm certain, from the beginning of the diplomacy inside the administration. I don't speak for it because I'm not briefed by it, but I just read the newspaper and I see it. There are African countries participating. There are other European countries participating. There are, I believe, a couple of Middle Eastern countries participating, and there's financial support from various parts of the globe. So this is not a solo U.S. operation, nor should it be. I would, I guess, conclude by saying that some of the questions that are going to have to be solved along the way, and General Ricky has stressed some of these, are working out a precise local and regional rule of engagement. As I say, I think that's a day-to-day thing up to now. I don't think you can have a countrywide policy, one defined in New York or in Washington on that. But a rule of engagement for dealing with people who are potentially hostile. The question of disarming it cannot be ducked, nor can the question of forming new or legitimate security institutions be ducked. It is not for us to do, it's for Somalis to do. But again, it's part of the hoped-for product of this consultative process that must continue on a daily basis. The question of how and when we hand the baton back to the more conventional blue helmet type operation, as General Ricky has defined it, is of vital importance. I would hope we're not pressed to answer that question, either by our friends in the media or by our friends in Congress or by anyone, because you don't want to answer prematurely. You want to answer when the preparation has been done as to when you can actually do that. A lot of attention has been given here today to a vital issue, which is how to build on our conference here, sponsored by the Institute, the Geneva conference before it. Many other conferences are taking place in Ethiopia and elsewhere. How to build on that and who should do it. Again, it wouldn't seem logical to me that it should be for the U.S. to do that. We can facilitate it, but we should be looking to the UN and to other groups, the OAU perhaps, to play a role in that regard, to promote and to encourage the process of leadership identification, the process of forming consensus about steps towards national reconciliation. That's obviously crucial. What we have, if you look more broadly beyond Somalia, is a situation globally in which there is a deficit of mechanisms for maintaining and enforcing rules. The deficit starts with rules that are in doubt, and then secondly with institutions that are not used to coping with problems that they now face. These are new problems. These are not previously familiar problems from the heyday of the Cold War. These are new problems. And then thirdly, with finding the means for carrying out whatever decisions may be agreed upon by the international community, whether it's at the regional level or at the international level. The issue of enforcement. You can't only have meetings and say, well, it would be great if we did this, let's do this, and then there's no means of follow-up. Enforcement, implementation are obviously key. So this deficit, which I have sometimes called a law and order deficit, I don't want to be misunderstood, it's really a situation globally, it's not just Somalia, in which we have to begin to improvise and to come to consensus on new ways of doing business, new principles, new doctrines, and some new institutions. That sounds like a mouthful. I don't mean to put it in too big of a context, but I think what I'm really saying is that Somalia is going to be a precedent in more ways than one, and it certainly isn't too late. With that, I am going to go back to questions and answers, and again, would you identify yourself when you ask your question? Yes, sir, right here.
Stan Meisler, the Los Angeles Times. This is for General Ricky. I'm wondering, can you envision in the second phase, when the UN force comes in and replaces the American-led force, can you envision this new force coming in with new rules of engagement, more aggressive rules of engagement, becoming more like what the Secretary General has described as peace enforcers rather than peacekeepers? Or do you expect them to go back to the rules of engagement that the Pakistani units had previously?
The mood in the UN as of today, or yesterday to be more accurate, is that there will be no change in the rules of engagement of traditional peacekeeping. In other words, the United Nations Peacekeeping Force, which is being put together now for Phase 2, will follow the same traditional rules of engagement that it has done so far. However, as you have very well pointed out, that the Secretary General himself has raised this whole question in his report to the Security Council with the title Agenda for Peace. And he is recommended for consideration by the Security Council and by the members of the UN a decision for rules of engagement which are between the two types of operations. At one end has been traditional peacekeeping, which has been non-enforcement action, and the permission to use force, like any of us on the street outside, and when we are attacked, we may use self-defense to the limits necessary and to our ability necessary. The other end being enforcement action, as exemplified by the coalition operation authorized by the UN in case of removing Iraq from Kuwait, and previously in the case of Korea. Now, the humanitarian operations have come in, which Dr. Crocker has referred to, was the first example of use of enforcement action was in the Kurdish situation in northern Iraq, and now it is in case of Somalia. Now, the way the next force is being put together is that the mood of the member states has not yet changed sufficiently for the Secretary General to be able to obtain that middle type of an operation, and therefore you can see his great concern in trying to have conditions created and an environment created where it will be possible for the UN to operate. I personally think that if the UN immediately is not ready to change to the middle rule, which I believe very strongly that they should, and may in fact will have to, and I think there will be a gradual upsurge of views in the UN that the UN should take over this job. But if for the course of the next phase of the operation, if they are not, my understanding is, or my belief is, that the US-led forces, but mostly they are American forces, that the American commanders with the consent of their government and their president and the commander-in-chief or the new commander-in-chief, they will create sufficiently, they will create conditions where it will be possible for the UN to take over. I'd like just to remind you and conclude with one remark. If those of you remember Lebanon, 1958, where the Marines landed, and eventually they restored law and order in the city of Beirut. But then they realized that they'd done their job, and they created conditions for them to withdraw, and the UN observers were increased sufficiently so that they could take over their job. I envisage very close consultation between the United States administration, the armed forces of the United States, the command of the US, with the UN, and more specifically at the local level. And we are very fortunate in having the leadership that we have on the ground today in Somalia, both on the side of the United States as well as the UN.
Adewa, do you want to add a word on that?
I'd just like to tag on to this notion about the two phases. It's clear that we don't think of them as one phase ending on one day and the second phase starting on the next day. That since the discussion has talked about the phases being mixed, I don't know the word, but that you will have troops who are engaged in both phases, that it's going to be impossible to have people who are going to work by the established rules. And for that reason, I think it's critical that the UN move quickly to pass a resolution that does talk about phase 2 and the fact that the rules of engagement have to be different, and I think clearly will be.
I could add another observation on that same point. I think that General Rickey is making a conservative forecast, and anyone who's worked in that institution as long as he has would probably do that. We are going to see second-generation type peacekeeping in our lifetime. I think it's a safe answer to your question. The question is, are we going to see it because of the Somali crisis? I personally hope we are. And I hope that that baton can be passed without it leading to a tremendous theological self-review about whether it's okay to go beyond traditional peacekeeping. We're going to have to. If not here, where? Yes, over there.
I'm Jim Matlack with the American Friends Service Committee. I have questions on two aspects of the clearance or authority for the action taken. Some of the agencies with staff on the ground clearly wanted to have increased security to permit the relief efforts to go forward, but we're not necessarily asking for so large and so dominantly a U.S. role in that force. That may have been the only practical answer in some sense, but it raises at least two questions I'd like some response to. Would it have been better if it was so large a UN force, but the command and control function was in fact in the UN, which our national leadership was unwilling to relinquish? And at the moment, we're operating with U.S. command and control under a kind of UN stamp of approval. The second point is perhaps more particularly to Adjua and perhaps Chester Crocker. With the scale of activity and the potential for violence, at least, is this a case where the War Powers Act should be at least looked at, debated, and voted? I assume it would be passed very quickly and unanimously, but should our constitutional process recognize this instance as one in which the War Powers Act is activated and should be followed through?
I think the first part of that should go to General Rickey, and maybe Adjua and I can have a crack at the second, if that's agreeable.
As to the UN ability to take over this responsibility, I would very much wish that it was possible. But as again, I want to draw your attention to the Secretary General's report, Agenda for Peace. He has suggested that he should have the ability to manage these operations. And so far, as you know, there has been no serious debate. There are several committees of the General Assembly which are looking at some of the aspects of the ideas which the Secretary General has put forward. And it is expected that the General Assembly, before it concludes the session, which it may not do by the end of the year, they may have to go across into the new year, will have specific ideas, as well as the members of the Security Council, when they are allowed a few hours to think, instead of constantly worrying about another new conflict, may have time to be able to devote to this very, very important question. As the situation stands today, as much as I regret it, the UN does not have the capacity to manage properly even the operations that it commands today. With the approval of the Mozambique operation, the size of the UN peacekeeping army has reached 60,000. Would you like to think for a moment as how many countries in the world have a force of that size? And do you know that there is a total of 8 staff officers with Mr. Goulding, who was a very fine Undersecretary General who's managing these operations? It really is quite impossible. It just can't be done. And so therefore, all these operations get very broad direction, more of a political direction, and some personnel changes in senior staff positions. Other than that, these operations are being run entirely on their own. And they work, luckily, because of the determination of the member states who send troops, who want to make sure that these operations are successful. But if you raise this issue as a management issue, it is at the lowest end of the totem pole.
Thank you, General Rickey. Adewadun, do you want to add a word on the second part of that question, or either part of it?
On the second part. On the War Powers Act, basically, there are two views in Congress. Well, there are probably more than two, but at least they fall at both spectrum. One, that the War Powers Act is not applicable because of that it's not applicable, and secondly, that it is. The people who have, the administration has, in the spirit of the War Powers Act, sent a letter to Congress notifying them of the operation 48 hours after the initial deployment, but not recognizing that they are in fact responding to the War Powers Act. I think, though, that we will see in the first days of Congress, maybe as early as the beginning of January when Congress comes back into session, some discussion, and probably in the hearing that's being held today, Congressman Hamilton will raise the issue of war powers because he is certainly one person who's been concerned with it over the years.
Just a brief comment on several aspects of that question. We are the dominant element in the force that has been sent, I think because we were prepared to do it, and our leadership, in its wisdom, doesn't want to do things halfway, and doesn't like to go into situations accepting with the overwhelming odds on your side. That is the doctrine that has come to be called, I guess, the Powell Doctrine. I don't know, but that is the view, and there's a very strong view about U.S. command. I might say that as soon as it was clear there was going to be American action, there were an awful lot of other people rushing to get a place at the table and to join in. And that's, to me, heartening in a way. I mean, it is a reality that there isn't any other country that can project power quickly on that scale. And if that's what it takes to do the right thing, then I guess that's what's happened. The war powers issue is beyond my pay grade. I'm glad there are only two views in Congress. Things have changed since I used to engage constructively with it on a regular basis. But obviously the Congress ought to be involved and ought to be consulted, and I trust has been, as was the team of the President-elect, I believe, before things were locked in concrete. This is a consultative world we live in. This couldn't have happened if we hadn't, in fact, gone to Boutros Ghali and said, hey, would you like? And he said, sure. There's a question.
Can I just on the question of consultation, I think that there is a lot of disagreement in Congress about what actually determines whether you've been consulted or not, or whether you're simply being told. And I think that's an issue that will also come in the discussion on the War Powers Act, since consultation is a key component of it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Mahdi Abdi. I'm from the American Somali Council, which is an organization that helps Somalis here and abroad. And it's a comment and a question that I have. First, I'd like to make a statement about George Bush. I never thought I was going to be able to say something nice about the man, but it's great to see that I could be wrong. And what he has done is has given hope to a lot of people. And Somalis owe a debt that I think is going to be very hard to repay to Americans. And we really appreciate that. And my comment is that since the Marine landed, at the beginning we had an aggressive policy whereby they were confiscating every single weapon they came across. And I don't want to go back on the same issues that we already discussed. But the new policy of, I don't know whether it's a new policy, but what we've seen through in TV these days is that all that has been toned down, and it's making a lot of people nervous because it implies, or it gives the connotation that maybe there's some legitimacy being given to the warlords. They're no longer called the warlords. These days they're called the regional leaders, which also has implications. And my question is, these are the same people who a few weeks ago did not allow food to go through and feed these starving Somalis. And we need to be very careful what we're doing here. The United States may be there on a humanitarian reason, but what it can do it's very wide, and it can have an incredible impact on the future of Somalia. If the United States policy is to allow these people who a lot of Somalis believe have caused this tragedy to keep their weapons, then all of this Operation Hope is just for the TV media, just to see the submarine feeding these children. And I'm not criticizing that. We need that to happen. But in order to empower the Somali people, you need to remove the weapons. And without that happening, it's an exercise in futility. And the warlords are not only in the south. They're in the north, they're in Bardera, and they're in Kismayo. And they need to be dealt with. And the other aspect that I'd like to bring about is that we've seen Eagleberger pushing this idea of war crimes in Bosnia. What about Somalia? Are Somali lives less worthy? They're not worth investigating? Real crimes have happened in Somalia, and someone needs to answer to them. And we would like you or somebody else or whoever can do something about it to do something about it, because the Somali people are helpless. The idea to say that there are too many guns to handle in Somalia, that may be the case, but there are a whole lot more people who do not have guns who are being brutalized every day by those who have the guns. And for us to be sitting here and saying with all that much firepower in the country that can actually do some drastic changes, to sit by and watch this continue, I think it's an aberration. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you for that comment. I must say I'm 100% with you. I wish that there was a clearer possibility today to say, yes, that is going to be done. That is going to be done. But it's got to be done, and you know it and I know it, legitimately, or it's going to be a failure. It's going to blow up in our faces. I think that's where we are. I would like to ask one of our initial speakers to comment on that very question. I think it would be appropriate, and then perhaps ask General Ricky if he would also like to say a word. But I don't know, Professor Samatar, do you want to address this issue of war crimes, but also the issue of disarming the warlords or the faction leaders? I don't know if you want to say a word.
Well, maybe a couple of words. I think my sense, personal interpretation on what's floating and the general strategy of Mission Hope is not only to get food to the people, but to also create at least what I have called a new civic space in which different kind of a leadership can come out of the Somali society. The ones who are now at the forefront will be tested, and all of that will be done without a gun. So to do so then will require, I think, whatever the tactic is, the inevitability of disarmament, I think, is, from my point of view, non-negotiable if we are going to get to a place in which peace will be created and that kind of a dialogue will transpire. And then the third phase then would be, I think, the issue of massive reconstruction of Somali society, in which basic infrastructure in many places, almost every place really, has been lost. So I endorse the idea of at least the principle of disarmament. How that is then becomes the tricky issue of engineering the strategy. On the issue of war crimes, yes, I think massive violations of human rights have taken place in Somalia. They have taken place in the destruction of the cities in the north, in Hargeisa particularly, and in Bur'o. Those have to be answered and accounted for, and they cannot just be shoved under the carpet as some past history. Massive violations have taken place in this triangle that Mukhtar was talking about. Massive violations have taken place in Mogadishu. There are people who have lived in Mogadishu for 70, 80, 100 years. And they have to leave now and go somewhere else and to restart life again in a place which they ostensibly came from in their origin. That has to be explained. Final point on the issue of war crimes. When I was doing some research in Somalia in 1989 and then in 1990 and 91 in the area, one of the people I talked to was the chief UNDP officer in Somalia, the United Nations chief in Somalia. And he told me this is a measure of how bad leadership has gone in Somalia. He talked to Siad Barre sometime, I think, towards the end of November of 1990. The two of them, just before he began to organize the evacuating the United Nations people in Mogadishu. And the chief of the UNDP told him, and he said, look, Mr. President, this country now I mean, it is really gone over the edge. The best you can do now is to leave tomorrow and hand this authority to someone else. You can deputize someone if you want to. You can, if you want to, you don't even give it to someone else. Just leave, because this might be the best you can do for them. And what he told the UNDP, I think, is very instructive, both in terms of war crimes, but also in terms of the issue of leadership, which I think is really a critical issue that Somalis have not yet engaged fully. And he said to the issue, he said, look, when I first came to Somalia as the head of state in 1969, Mogadishu was a little dusty hamlet. I mean, this is a quote. And Somalia was a very poor, peripheral kind of a state, even in the Horn of Africa. I have created a major country in the Horn of Africa, and I have created a great cosmopolitan center in Mogadishu. If Somalis want to make me run out of this place, run me out of what I have built, I am going to take this country and this city down with me. I mean, this is a quote, maybe some of the last things that Siad Barre has said. He's alive today, and I think he ought to account for his leadership in the 20 years he has run Somalia.
I think he said what I would have said.
Can I just add a word?
Yes, Barakat will add a word, and then General Ray.
A brief word. What I see developing in the former Yugoslav situation actually is a very promising use of the notion of Nuremberg type of trial for criminals. Even if you cannot send troops to stem the tide of Serb acquisitive binge, which seems to be the case right now, because it's not, to quote a recent expert, doable. He cannot intervene because it's not doable, but he may perhaps indirectly, by threatening a future sanction of criminal trial, inhibit the action. I think that's a very important point to emphasize in this developing new international law. I think it's important to explore, perhaps using the Somali experience, because these people clearly are criminals. We have to deal with them because they are part of the reality. I disagree with my friend Ahmed Samatar during the symposium at the Peace Institute when he said we should ignore them, we should not even deal with them. I think it was necessary to deal with them because they are part of the reality in order to save lives. At what stage we move forward to investigate and bring them to justice, to trial, is of course open to question. But the fact is that it is being asked by many Somalis.
General Ricky.
The disarming of the population of Somalia presents some very complex international legal issues. Our chairman was involved himself in a very superb negotiations which he brokered in Namibia, and the complexity of being able to disarm people who were local, who had their weapons, always presents itself in almost every situation, as it did also in the Congo and many other areas. More recently, as you know, the UN peacekeeping operation in El Salvador, which has concluded successfully on the 15th of December, included agreements which required the disarmament of the guerrillas. So, therefore, to begin with, it requires an agreement by all the parties, and that the parties are recognized parties in that particular conflict. Secondly, you are assuming that there's leadership, effective leadership of those parties. Thirdly, in the absence of there being an agreement, is the UN authorized operation being largely conducted by the United States? Do they have the authority to disarm the people? I can give you the answer straight away. No. They do not have the authority to disarm people. In their operational role, if they are obstructed, the international law will allow them the right of defense in being able to remove the weapons so that those who block them or obstruct them or fire at them, those weapons may be removed. So therefore, the preconditions for disarmament have not been obtained to the level at which the United Nations would like the United States troops to carry out. Certainly the Secretary General would like this because this is the best way out and it will make the job of the UN peacekeeping blue berets much simpler. But it is simply beyond any international law or custom for the United States to do, because they're not at war with Somalia. They're not an occupation force. They're unable to do so. So therefore, I would revert, Mr. Chairman, to the suggestions I made, that I think it should be part of the arrangements which are arrived at with the interim Somalian government, who then provides the necessary authority and creates a police force as soon as possible, and almost immediately requests the UN to collect heavy weapons, whether they're being used against the UN troops or United States troops or not. Simply remove the heavy weapons, bring them into storage, and let the Somalian people decide what they're going to do with those weapons. Are they going to create an army, and therefore should they give them the weapons? Now, finally, on the question of personal arms, you know very well what a controversial issue it is, the right of carrying arms. And who is to determine that? Only the Somalians. Nobody else can determine that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might just add one point on this issue of guns. Guns are the biggest problem that Africa faces in some ways today, both because of the threat they pose to civilian society and because they represent an alternative way to live, or an alternative way to make a living. And it has got to be addressed. But I think General Ricky's put his finger on it in terms of the complexity. If there's another way to do it, you don't want to do it by having to go in and say, we are going to take away your arms. What you want is an agreement that is legitimate with ground rules that are understood for collecting the arms and making them available one day to a legitimate security institution for the future of the country. Yes, something in the back of the room here. Yes, sir.
I think on the issue of war criminals, it is important to recognize, and I agree with Barakat and the rest, that at some point there ought to be a time to bring war criminals into process, because the spirit of the law in that country will in the end depend on how we deal with war criminals. There are today victims of torture who are living in this city and other parts of the world that are not given a fair hearing because the war criminals are walking in of the law in that country will in the end depend on how we deal with war criminals. There are today victims of torture who are living in this city and other parts of the world that are not given a fair hearing because the war criminals are walking in this street. It so happens, by the way, before you talk about war criminals in Mogadishu or in the bush, that there have been war criminals in Canada who have escaped, who entered into Canada, and the Canadian government have discovered them and expelled them out of their country, and they are today in Washington, D.C. with documents of having murdered and killed. Further, I think the point about, so before you talk about capturing war criminals in the bush, in this country of laws, there ought to be at least an attempt to look at those criminals that are in this country right now, having been expelled from Canada. Further, I think the point about humanitarian, the American intervention is quite clearly humanitarian. We heard it again and again. But also we have to be really realistic, because massive intervention of that sort is not purely humanitarian. It becomes willy-nilly political. And when you hear Somalis talk to you, disarm this guy or this group, it is political, because there is a decision to say, now that you are in Mogadishu, just disarm those in Mogadishu, not the rest of the country. You have to be very careful on this issue of disarmament. And the more I think the US gets involved, the more the humanitarian element potentially could be weakened and the political issue comes up, the more you pick up the issue of collecting arms. And in fact, strangely, people are talking about the cat and what Chad does and the drugs, so-called, and stopping it. So one has to be careful about that whole complex of issues. With regards to the UN, I should say, I think the anxiety about Somali's anxiety at the present time is not the U.S. intervention, it's what the UN will do. Ambassador Sahnoun, a caring, independent man who has labored to learn Somalis, he really, more than any other UN representative that Somalis can tell you, has gone down to the ground, talked not to warlords, he talked to elders, he talked to religious people, he talked to every level of Somali society, and he has given the UN a measure of credibility it did not deserve over the past so many years when it had pulled out. And what frightens many Somalis is that a man they began to respect and to really associate with the UN has been expelled because he was able to tell what the facts were. Will the UN, and I'm really general, I'm not specifically referring to you, others may comment, I with due respect, with regards to the Somalis, the UN has not really worked for credibility. It does not have a credibility. Its history has not been one credible one with regards to Somalis. I think the United States, having put its own men in there, it would be very important not to just pass on to the UN with lack of its own credibility to run Somali lives. And that's one has to be very careful about that as well.
Thank you very much for your comment. Is there a question over here? Yes. Yeah.
The situation in the northern part of the country. Okay, SUNY College, National Public Radio. The situation in the northern part of Somalia has deteriorated, humanitarian and political, in the last 72 hours. There are several people in the administration who are talking that the operation, the U.S.-led intervention, will have to be expanded. Do either of you see it inevitable that the United Nations is going to have to intervene or establish some kind of presence up in the north? And if it does, will the costs of expanding the operation to include the northern part, both the political, military, and economic, will those costs almost be too prohibitive to sort of have us limit whatever is going to be done up in the north?
I think I just make one opening point, and then I'm going to turn it to our experts. The report which they produced makes a specific reference to a differential kind of involvement by the international community, depending on conditions in regions. And it's very carefully and repeatedly underscored in the report, which I'm sure you've seen, that whatever we do, we, the U.S. or the UN, should be done bearing in mind local circumstances, which are different in every sub-region of the country. Now, I don't know if you want to expand on that, Professor Samet.
Yes, I think Dr. Crocker is right, and we did do that in the report. I have no information which confirms what the question says, and that is conditions have deteriorated in the north in the last 72 hours. I have no information on that. My take on this, and I think the group's take on this, is that there are regions and parts of what used to be called Somalia that have created a modicum of order and peace and began to rehabilitate some of the infrastructure of life. But that is an extremely precarious setup, very rickety and very precarious. What they need, therefore, in north, northwest, other places, perhaps, is intervention at the level of support, restarting the schools, restarting electricity, the infrastructure of life, and maybe beefing up whatever authority and sense of order that they have created so that they would withstand, I think, the tensions that are inevitable in a society that really has come apart. So I'm not too sure whether the idea of having the mission Hope now expand into the north because of some, I think, unconfirmed report is really a wise one. I think it is unwise. I think it is important to note at least what the realities are in the north and in the northeast. And my argument is that, at least the information I have, is that there really are not the kind of crisis of order and stability that has been so conspicuous in Mogadishu and the southern part of the country. They need food, they need electricity, they need infrastructure, and soon, but not military intervention.
We have a Somali elder at the head table who also wants to offer a comment on this question. Yeah, this is one that works.
Is it working? Is it working? No. Just a brief comment to respond and to highlight, I think, what Dr. Hussein raised earlier. Dr. Hussein Bulhan raised in his comment, and it's important for that one. I think what Ahmed has responded to the question. What Dr. Hussein raised is the fears of Somalis about the UN. And it appeared even in the list of countries. I think Ambassador Oakley got into that in the press. Italy and Egypt are disliked in several parts of Somalia. And this has been made clear several times. Therefore, the idea of just every country who wants to go there must be welcomed by the Somalis takes too far. the humiliation of Somalia and the fact that there is no government. I think there should be negotiations of placing them. Secondly, Somalis feel that the U.S. should decrease their force over time, but should remain with their force as part of a UN force. A limited force, but a U.S. force should remain. There was talk about the force in the sea might remain, but even on land, this is appreciated. So these, I think, are good points to just bear in mind from dialogues, from what is seen. But there are two aspects of the human side which I like to raise, which are important. And that is, somebody told me about the Northwest. There was talk at that time that some other, if not Egyptian, they will go Belgians or some people. It was not before the US. And the population went to, the government said they don't need them, they should go to the south. So some members of the population who are very private sector oriented say to the government, are you fighting? They said no. So you have peace, right? Then why are you afraid of some foreign troops here? The foreign troops are not going to do anything to you. They'll hang around and we'll be able to sell our cigarettes. Our women will sell the cigarettes and so on. That's a deep understanding that with foreign troops might come foreign aid, might come attention, and might come possibly the building of some infrastructure. So that was one side. The other side was on the US force, it's not just because it was effective and can deliver. Some of us felt that the US military is a military from a democratic country and it's followed by the press and is followed by Congress and is criticized, and therefore it's much more easier to pull out than a bureaucratic melange of UN forces, most of whom are there just to get a salary. Some come from, like Pakistan means they're coming from a dictatorship, so it doesn't really matter what kind of government you have or they have, so they can't participate in that kind of dialogue with you. And lastly, the experience of West Africa, where West African troops went to Liberia. Look at the track record. They became part of the smuggling, partly because they're underpaid. And it's sad to say that, because it's the same way we hate to say it about Somalia, but it's a fact in Africa. Their countries are not able to back them up logistically, and they have even become a local force now, a real local tribe in a bigger sense than what Mukhtar was saying with the Americans. So this I think should be understood in this context.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists here for their splendid contributions. We appreciate people taking the time to come. I'd like to thank the audience, and I also want to thank all the staff, David Smock and his colleagues of the Institute, who made this event possible. Thank you.
This discussion on plans for promoting peace and stability in Somalia was sponsored by the U.S. Institute of Peace. The event was a follow-up to earlier conferences